Welcome back, folks, to the Get a Grip on Lighting Conversation Series. That's right. Greg and I are stepping back, and we got two amazing hosts. How do I know? Because I've listened to their shows. I already heard this one. It's so good. It's Webb Marsh and Ron Kuzmar talking lighting controls. They're doing a six pack with us. This is the second one. And their guest today is Paula Martinez-Nobles. That's right. And they get into lighting controls and everything else. And we'll save that, put a pin in that, because we're going to talk about the magicians, Greg Garrick from Evluma. Go to evluma.com. That's right, the magicians. What do
Now,
they
just
got?
about every lighting company out there has a cob light, right? They have a bunch of LEDs built around it. But there are a lot of instances where you need something different. Maybe you have a decorative post light that needs a high pressure sodium color, for one. You know who's got something? Evluma. They've got 2000 Kelvin up to 5000 Kelvin all built in as options you can do. So you can match a high pressure sodium look, compact size. It gives you everything you need with an omnidirectional light engine and 10 kV and 10 kA of surge protection. That's the issue with a lot of cobs is they burn out from the surge. Evluma overdoes it, gets it so that it won't be a problem for you. Check these guys out.
Some people have 3000K cobs. Some people. But most people only have 4000 and 5000K. Evluma, the magicians, they take it right down to 2000K so you can match that gaslight color, the high pressure sodium. Go to the magicians at evluma.com. And of course, the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, the funders of all the best lighting media in the market. That's right, I'm just going to say it. And of course, the Lighting Agora and the Lighting Controls Association, two guest presenters on this conversation series because it's so important. For right now, we're going to throw you over to Webb Marsh and Ron Kuzmar coming in hot on the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast conversation series. Ooh.
All right, well, welcome to our talk. I'm the self proclaimed lighting control specialist, Webster Marsh, and my co host, Ron Kuzmar. And we have here Paula. She is a designer, and we're really here to get an idea of what it is she does when it comes to lighting control specifically. So, Paula, just out of curiosity, what is it that you do, just so that our guests can get an understanding of what your responsibilities are in your current job, and then you know we'll get into it after that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having me also. So yes, I'm a lighting designer. I'm also a principal at Fisher Marantz Stone. I wear many hats. I'm also the studio director, which really just means that I'm in charge of making sure our team is really well prepared to handle the kind of projects that we really are privileged to do on a regular basis. Our team is has been in New York for 50 years. We've got quite a long legacy, and so we are very fortunate to work on some really extreme, whether it's theater projects or facade control, um, big flashy things and international work, or really just a little bit more toned down, residential work, museum work, office, corporate, you name it, we're doing a part of it.
Well, awesome. Well, and thank you for joining us. So, I mean, when it comes to lighting control specifically, I mean, you do wear a lot of different hats here, but what is it that you do when a project it's clear that you need to kind of carry that torch with lighting controls? Where do you start? Where do you go? Where do you end when it comes to that?
Sure. And so, probably one of the answers you get all the time is it really does depend on the project. And for us, because again, we've got such a variety of project types, it especially depends on, for just giving an example, a corporate project that might have a very high-end auditorium or multi-purpose room. We are asked to be very involved in making sure we're collecting the information from ownership from the client to understand how that space is being used. So we're not only layering in the lighting design, but also the functionality of the space. Do we have enough different scenes to be able to provide what the client needs? In some cases, we're doing law firms, so you might have a moot court. The auditorium has multiple uses. And so we want to be able to provide not just the multiple layers of lighting, but also the control compatibility to be able to do that in a user friendly kind of way. Um, on a theatrical project, maybe we'll be involved with a theater consultant, and they might have all the nuts and bolts of the auditorium, the theater space itself. But typically, we're supporting them right outside of those doors, right? So we try to work collaboratively with that team so that the user has a system that's compatible not just in the architectural spaces, but also the theater, right? So it's one big system, even if they don't physically touch and communicate with each other, that the user is able to have a system that is similar enough or compatible so that they're not having to deal with two different things.
Right. So, I mean, to kind of sum that up, you kind of take on a role of owner's representative in a way when it comes to design intent of lighting control systems. You may not actually be the person with the bug in the ear of the owner, but you are essentially representing to all other trades what the goal is when it comes to the lighting control
A-
system.
Absolutely. Yep. And
So
and a
I
lot of
imagine.
that comes. Mhm.
No, no, go ahead.
So a lot of that comes into play. A lot of our projects now have owner project managers. They have the client itself. They have the architect, and sometimes we're in the middle, being almost translator. We're understanding the technical aspects of it, the architectural aesthetic aspects of it, and having to translate that to the team, to the owner project management group, to the owner in terms of what kind of how can you get your best bang for your buck. How can we give you the choices, the options, so that you understand what are you gaining, what are you losing, what is it going to roughly cost you, ballpark. We don't have a say, or we don't have exact numbers of what control systems might cost, but we have a range that we understand based on just working with reps in the industry, and especially being in New York City. We get a chance to work very closely with the reps and the manufacturers, and so we're able to really advise the client, and sometimes help the owner project management team really understand what we're trying to provide the team, as opposed to letting them kind of do all of the estimating on their own terms.
Right. Or in the event that you're not the specifier for lighting controls,
Right.
you kind of have to help even guide that ship, even though you're technically not responsible for that. And so
Absolutely, yeah. Mhm.
to kind of Ron's defense, he becomes an asset in that, to kind of bridge that gap, to make sure that even if you aren't the person holding the reins, you have somebody who can ultimately, in the end of the project, have the
Right.
reins, and you can trust
Yep.
that that project's going to be successful. So,
Yep.
yeah, I mean, when it comes to system design, it's a real handicap when you don't have that scope, though.
No, it definitely is, and ultimately, um, you see lighting, and you see lighting either not dimming up and down as it's supposed to. So the first instinct you're going to have as an owner client is to say, "Oh, something's not working with the lighting design." So the first call that
Mhm.
goes out is to the lighting designer, and I think you've mentioned before that you often are called back a year or 2 years later. We're also called back a year or 2 years later, and it's always really interesting to see, like, all right, what dots didn't get connected, and how can we try to close it all out again without starting a whole nother project.
Well, it's even worse sometimes when the client has clearly been living with the issue for multiple
Yeah.
years, and you get that call, and it's like, I really wish you had called me like so many times earlier than
uh,
this. Like,
or or even worse, it was on the punch list.
right.
It needed to get resolved. It never got resolved.
Right, and so that's a real trick right there. I mean, maybe some of the people listening in might not realize, but just because you put it on a punch list doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to get worked out. I mean,
Right.
sometimes that punch list just gets ignored, or the contractor's already done with the project by the time that
Exactly.
that punch list gets kicked over to them. So, I mean, part of the additional hat, with these multiple hats that you're wearing, it's almost coordinator too. You kind of have to herd these cats to make sure that that everything's done correctly. And so, talk a little bit more about what that coordination is like.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, and again, it depends on the time of the project, the timeline, what phase you're in. and even just closing out a job, right? Getting on site, coordinating times with the integrator perhaps or with the manufacturer, and we actually have a project now where it has been extremely difficult to identify where the problem is along the line, right? We've had the controls manufacturer involved, we've had the electrical contractor involved, the manufacturer for the LEDs and the drivers. We've got the rep agents, so we've got the architect, the contractor. Everybody's got a say or a play in the owner project management team, trying to pull all the teams together. And there's something not clicking, something not working, something didn't get reviewed in the installation, and we haven't been able to, you know, kind of work it out.
So cool. So in the case of that specific project, I'm very curious,
Mhm.
is there an integrator currently involved to sort of help tie some of this together, or is there not one?
There isn't one. And so
Okay.
for that particular job, that's the sort of, to your point, um, we're wearing that hat where we're reaching out to the manufacturer and we're saying, please make sure you're speaking to the contractor, troubleshoot these things. What else do you have to troubleshoot? And so we're playing that integrator almost role of saying, all right, you go check with this. I'm not in the drivers themselves unwiring and wiring things like maybe an integrator
Right.
would, but definitely having to facilitate communicating between different teams.
It's a really
So I mean, you
tough role to be in because the electrician is ultimately saying, "Well, it's not my fault," right? And the driver
Right.
manufacturer says, "Well, it's not us." And it's a really tough role to be in without having sort of that dedicated middleman that's in charge of the project that can really point to a specific issue and say, "Nope, this is what it is," and really hammer that home and get it resolved.
Right. Exactly.
yeah. So I mean, and then adding to that, it's almost like you have to be prepared to take on that role if the fee of the project or the scope doesn't cover including an additional person such as an integrator. So in the event that it's a massively complex project, but they don't want to pay for an integrator, what do you do?
I mean, we rely heavily on the manufacturers. We rely heavily on the reps to be able to help coordinate things, and their brand is just as much on the line as ours is. And so we want to make sure that we're, having that conversation that, if we all look good, then if I look good, all look good. Now, if it starts to look bad, then it just trickles down. But of course, as the person who's talking to the architect and the client, we're sort of the first the first person to get attacked.
Right, right, yeah. And so, I mean, the manufacturer's rep becomes an essential player, but at that point, not having this third party integrator involved, you're kind of stuck with the manufacturer's limitations because they can't,
Right.
per the conversation we had last time with Ron, he can kind of leap from manufacturer to manufacturer. But if you're working with one rep, I've done projects with multiple manufacturers on the system, and you kind of have to really make sure that they communicate with each other because otherwise they don't touch each other's equipment. They don't really work
Yeah.
on each other's systems. So
Yeah, and it's
um
it's not great to leave it to fate, right? It's not great to
right.
say, okay, hopefully this contractor will actually get really excited about the project and take it under their purview to make sure everything looks great and works wonderfully. And sometimes we really luck out, and there are some really great contractors and electricians that get excited about things and they enjoy the challenge. But you're not always so lucky.
Well, and I mean that's the specifier's job is to make sure that things are detailed out. If things aren't in the documentation, then it's up to the contractor to make the guesswork. And so, making sure that a system is fully vetted before it's out to bid can be really challenging, especially if, for instance, the owner doesn't have a clear intent in mind and you kind of have to guess for them. So, in the event, I know a lot of designers will have sort of a default format in the event that the owner doesn't have an intent in mind. But do you have something in mind? Do you usually have a conversation? Do you have questions that you ask? Like, how do you overcome that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, we try to have all of those conversations up front, and usually it happens, we'll poke at DD, we'll poke at CD, and right before that final issuance goes out, we try to, sound the alarm again and say, we really want to make sure that this gets caught in the specs. We want to make sure that you're not hit at a later date with an additional charge, a change order, because something didn't get captured. And it also helps a tremendous amount to have architects that you develop a relationship with, you have a style of working together, and frankly their understanding of our work is always helpful, right? When you have new clients and new relationships, that always gets a little bit more complicated. When you have existing ones, it there's a form work, there's a way to kind of step through, and everybody's kind of in the clear that, all right, we put a pin in this one. That means we're all going to revisit it in CA, and we're all going to enjoy the conversation then. But um, when you don't have that sort of understanding, then yeah, then it's on us to keep sounding the alarm until we get some sort of response. And
Right.
you know that you've got to cover enough in the spec to at least get you
Right.
95% there.
Right. But I mean, to kind of counter argue that point, a lot of specifiers, right now at least, don't really flag the attention to that issue. And I would say that what you're doing is above and beyond the majority of specifiers out there, maybe not lighting designers specifically, but engineers, architects. Maybe the project timeline is just too much of a crunch for them to actually have this conversation about such a small portion of the project known as lighting controls, that they're just trying to push this out the door, get it done so that it meets, what they want. So, I mean, I think that it's great that you really try to establish with your existing clients, because that really says a lot about the service you're providing.
Yeah.
And I think that, our listeners hopefully are taking this in and going, hey, maybe we should be doing this too. Because, project success with lighting controls right now is abysmal. A lot of
Yeah.
people hate lighting controls. A lot of owners right now have started to weed out systems because of bad experience. And I don't think it's the
Yeah.
system's fault. I think part of it
Yeah.
is contractors, part of it is specifiers, part of it is, owners. But I think everybody, if you have somebody who, like yourself, who's really expertise when it comes to this information, is really continuing to hammer over people's heads, you get something back from that project,
Yeah.
and you
Well,
get
I think something that helps us and our team and our office is you do have we have a good group of people that have experience for more than a couple of years, right? They've got a dozen years of experience, or that there's somebody near them that has at least a dozen years of experience. And so with that comes the ability of really focusing in on the most important parts that are going to be relevant to the user, right? You don't want to go down the rabbit hole of, oh, do you want it to be 0 to 10 or DMX? You don't want to have that conversation with the client. And sometimes the client does have a person in their group that wants to get into the details, wants to get into the weeds, but you got to keep it high level enough for them to understand, what am I missing if I don't have this, or what am I going to gain? And I think that, to your point, Webster, it's our responsibility as the specifier to be able to understand that you've got to put it in some terms that they're going to understand, that they're going to kind of react to and want to pay attention. Because I think a lot of times, if an owner is not willing to answer a question, it's because they don't understand.
I think that's a really good point. And so I'm curious, if you have some examples of terminology language that you use, or questions that you ask in lieu of saying, hey, do you want 0 to 10? Because I, that is a very specific question being asked. It's asking something that I don't even know if necessarily every lighting designer needs to be able to ask that question. I think definitely when you're at the specification level, you're detailing out the luminaire requirements for sure. But I think at the high scope, you're right. There's something else out there that needs to be asked even before you get to that level.
Yeah. We ask a lot of programmatic questions. How do you envision using the space? What kind of space in the building do we have to go and bury controls? How much changing are you going to do after this initial build? Are you imagining that you're going to have conference room turned into offices at a later point? It's a lot of just questions that are broad and seemingly unrelated, but you tie it back to the reasons why you're going with a specific control system.
For sure, and I think that those kinds of questions do come from a place of knowledge. I mean, you can't
Right.
just say, oh, where are the lighting controls going to be stored without understanding that there's a big panel that needs to go somewhere.
Right.
So understanding that is part of this whole questionnaire. And so if you have an owner, for instance, who has space limitations in their project. You know that electrical rooms are really tight and you're not going to be able to put much in there. Okay, where can we mount stuff? Do we have plenum space? Do we, all of
Right.
these questions are fantastic ways of leading to an answer that can help you identify the system. Ron, you had a thought.
Yeah, so sort of spinning off of that a little bit more, based on the answers you get back from the client, from the OPM, at which point do you decide, hey, look, based on everything, and you go back to your team and based on everything they've come back with, at what point do you guys sort of sit down and decide, this is a project that really could use an integrator or maybe it doesn't? And then how do you approach that with the client and the OPM if it wasn't something that you originally envisioned being a need?
Sure. Yeah, and I mean we will typically I think DD is a good time. Excuse me. DD is a good time to start thinking of, is this a project that's perhaps complex enough that it's really going to require an integrator, somebody to be hands-on throughout this process. And at that point we will have that conversation with the owner project manager or the client, depending on the relationships there. Um, but as far as us, picking a system, that probably comes right before saying, all right, if we're going to go that route, then we probably need system plus integrator. Or actually, we can just go with this system. This is going to be typical enough for a typical electrician to handle, or this might get complex. Let's see if we can add this into the specification that we need somebody else to come in and help.
And so, I mean, integrators are an essential part of that. Are there other specialists that you'll tap if something needs some kind of hovering? That, I mean, lighting designers cover a lot of bases, but are there others who can support lighting designers?
No, absolutely. Actually, that's a really good point because we actually have an example of that. We had a project where we were pushing for the integrator angle, and we were having a really hard time convincing the owner that that was required and that that added cost was needed because they're looking at us and why did we hire you, or what do we have an electrical contractor for, or what about the control system that we've specified? And right here it says that this person's going to be on site however many days. And we're trying to explain, no, 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 that's not what we mean. And it gets to a point where there's only so much explaining we can do. And so where on that particular project, what was very useful, helpful was speaking to the manufacturer, working through with them their bill of materials and understanding what parts of this go away, what parts of maybe site support goes away and gets taken up by the integrator, and at what point do you also want an integrator because you don't want those phone calls. And so we all make out better if we actually get this into the spec early on and get everybody on the same page, and then we can start working in that direction together.
Well, and I think you really brought up an excellent conversation point to have in the CD process, which is understanding where the cost of the system is going to be distributed, because there are so many projects I've seen happen where there's a double billing as a result of the fact that
Right.
they went, oh, okay, we need an integrator and we need this and we need this. And it just kind of cascades. And suddenly you have a $50,000 lighting control system that's $150,000. So, I think really making sure to have those conversations when you are grabbing additional services outside of the manufacturer. I like to say manufacturer provided integrator versus lighting control system integrator, third party integrator, because of that, because technically the manufacturer does provide integration services.
Right.
Um, and so, out of curiosity, what does that conversation? How does that conversation with the manufacturer go when you start trying to cherry pick services out.
I mean, fortunately for us, I think we've got good relationships with our manufacturers that nobody felt like I was taking too much away from them. No, and
Yeah.
I think it was what's the word, reciprocal, or they understood just as much as we did that it was important to have an integrator for this kind of project,
Mhm.
and it was important for for the effects we were going for. Um, it was an experience architecture museum project that we did several years ago, and so it was critical for somebody to really be able to communicate, just sort of like how we translate to the client. It was important for another party to be there to help translate between us, the aesthetics, the design, the concept, and the programming guy who's making it all, or our gal making it all happen.
And the programming guy, I mean, that was the integrator, or was that an additional person?
We ended up on that particular project. The integrator was kind of overarching. They had hands on everything, but there was a specific programmer making things shift in color, in sequences, and things pop
Mhm.
here and there. It was multiple hands on that job. Yeah.
And did you bring in additional equipment with that integrator?
uh
Did like the
there
integrator bring in their own like console to kind of do that, or were you using the stock
mm,
system that was set up?
no, I think if I remember correctly, I think it was all part of the system. um I don't remember them bringing in additional
Sure.
components, the integrator bringing in additional components.
I just went on a project site where the integrator brought in an additional console to do the work. That's why I was asking that
Oh yeah.
question. But
I've had that happen on a mock-up, where
right.
we just said, we asked the rep, "Hey, can you help us? We need to program this for a mock-up." And he shows up with his little box and he's sliding things around. Like, this is so much better than I could have imagined. Thank you so much.
But I think that's a great example of why developing a relationship with a manufacturer's rep is also critical with lighting controls,
Yeah.
because they have that ability to just be like, okay, here's
Yeah.
a kit.
Yeah. Oh, and it doesn't get past me that, we're especially lucky in New York, right? Because we do
Mhm.
have those relationships,
Mm.
and we have your ETC and your Lutron guys, and they're all down the street, they're all down the block, right? And everybody's just a phone call away. Um, that's not the case in every city that we work in, right? We have a lot of projects in New York City, so that's very useful. We had a project in Florida, and I'm trying to figure out who can I call to get uh, support. And the team in New York was super helpful on the phone, but they couldn't get to where I was at quick enough. And so at that point, that integrator that we had in Florida was actually instrumental. It was, such a huge help because we could get on site together. We could quickly look through how do we fix some hiccups that we were having.
Right. And so, personally, if I were to specify an integrator, that would be something that I would put in my specs as a requirement, which is a distance limitation to the project site, you know, because of that very reason. And so I wonder, if you were to do a project in Dubai, would you be hunting down an integrator in Dubai?
It's probably one of the questions we would ask for sure. I mean,
Right.
for our project in Florida, we had a similar sort of conversation. There got to be a point in the middle of the project where we were looking at two different integrators, and we ended up settling, even though we were more familiar with the one that was mostly East Coast, Northeast Coast, and we ended up deciding for the one that was more local to the site because of its complexity, and wanting to just make sure that there weren't any delays in addressing the site.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. And so,
Yeah.
because I think a lot of people right now have a hard time finding integrators. I mean,
Yeah.
it's easy enough to type in integrator on Google and find like the big, you know, national wide groups, but they're actually quite boutique when it comes to size in the most part. And so, being able to zero in, I mean, sometimes I'll call the manufacturer and say, hey, do you know of any integrators in this area? Um, and I think, to your point, interviewing them, identifying who they are, talking to them, making sure that they can do what you need them to do before even working with them is really critical, because I've definitely had times where a rep has tried to sub an integrator on a project, and I'd look at the name and I'd look at the services that they provide, and I said, these aren't going to do what you need them to do. They're designers.
Yeah.
They're just going to give you some documents. Like, they're not actually going to go in there with a screwdriver and make sure everything's terminated.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but you know, so kind of winding back to finishing the project out. We've talked about getting started, kind of following through in the middle, but then when you're closing the project out, what is your responsibility?
And where our services very rarely don't include some site days, right? Very rarely are we not on the job. 99.9% of our projects we're on site on the final days, final hours sometimes, walking out the back door as the guests are coming in the front. Um, and so what that means is we're making sure, we're hoping that things have worked themselves out, or we've nudged enough people or shoved enough people to get their attention to to troubleshoot, make sure the control system's working. I think where often there's an area of sort of cloudiness is, does the client actually get their training in, right? Because often we're not involved in that. And we might have sold the client on, yeah, you're gonna know how to use the system, you just got to have your team, and the manufacturer's going to train them, and it's easy peasy. But in reality, we have to be mindful when we say that, because the contractor's deciding at what point that's going to happen with the manufacturer. Sometimes that happens months, if not a year or more, after the site has been finalized. And so it's, again, there's just more calls that either we're getting or the architect's getting. So the site focusing and setting levels, and making sure the time clocks are all programmed, at least on day one, how they're supposed to be. That's almost the easy part. It's making sure then on day two that everybody's got what they expected. That's the scarier part.
Yeah, I think that's really kind of on nail on the head with that point, because yes, you can commission a project through and through and make sure that it meets the documentation that you created, but if the occupants, A, don't understand it, B, don't like it, or C, don't know who to reach out to because of these issues, that's really going to cause this whole distaste for the system.
Right.
And so, as a specifier, your hands are kind of tied because of that, because you can't just like
Mhm.
go and knock on the door and be like, "Hey, do you like the lighting control system I designed for you?" You kind of have to wait for
Right.
those calls to come in.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like best case, when you hear nothing, it went well.
Right? Yeah, Ron.
Yeah, so it's funny because like that's always, especially during training and during commissioning, that's always one of my big things with owners is live with it for 3 months or six
Yep.
months, and then make sure they know who to call, right? Because it's whether it's the electrician or it is the OPM getting a hold of you, or as a specifier. But that's one of the things I always try to make very clear is live with it for a little while, and understand how it functions and what it's doing, what it's not doing, take notes, and then be able to share all that information at once, just to try and make it smoother for them and to let them know that it's not necessarily going to be perfect, because we don't always know what's in their
Right.
heads.
Right. Well, and that's actually a conversation too that we have with the client as we're sort of, backing out of the project, and sort of turning over the keys to the job for them, right? All right, this is yours. When day two comes around and they say, oh, actually, we want to revisit the large conference room, and we want the scenes to be brighter or dimmer, whatever the case may be, it's threading that needle of, okay, but the system is yours now. Remember, in the specifications, you got the premium, like 2-year contract or 3-year, whatever it is, to have on-site service. Yeah, live with it. Like, see if that's what you really want to do, and then at some point you are able to change it. You don't have to pay us to come in. You guys can do this now, to the point where you're more comfortable with it. And it's those conversations happen every so often. But it's always fun to watch the owner go from like, oh, it's mine now. Yeah, okay, I get to adjust it.
That's great. So, I mean, when it comes to training them, I mean, do you ever like give them a hands-on course, or is that really something that you coordinate through other individuals?
The hands-on course and not on how to use the system, but we do like to push for if we're specifying this full system and if we're setting scenes and we're walking through, and again, depending on kind of the extent of the relationship with the client and how much hands-on they want to have. We like to have a few hours with the client to just walk room by room and say, all right, this is what we've done. This is what you should see. Again, similar to Ron, what you said, live with it for a while. You might change it later. But we like to walk them through their expectations that they should have so that they, at minimum, again, it's that translation, right? It's not about getting a tech and setting a percentage. It's not about
Mm.
that. It's how does it feel in the space? Does it feel good? Does it not feel good? We can tweak it a little bit more. Maybe we need to do another run through of scene setting, today. But there's that dialogue of at least having them understand the capabilities of the system, even though you talked about it
Mm.
6 months before or 3 years earlier. It's that walkthrough is always helpful.
I mean, and I totally agree. I think, thinking about listeners who are trying to go, okay, how am I going to design my fee around this now? Because it's an all-day affair. I mean, you can't just lump
Yeah.
this in with lighting, your punch list for your lighting, because especially, let's say, for instance, a high-rise hotel that has so many different variables, and you're trying to punch the lighting at the same time you're punching the controls. I mean, that sounds like it's going to be a major hassle to do it that way. So it sounds like you really kind of have to separate the two and say, okay,
Yeah.
we're going to do controls one day, we're going to do lighting another day. And additionally, on that point, coordinating your visits with the techs. I mean, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've definitely had this experience where the contractor has scheduled me to come punch a project. I show up, there's no tech, and
Yeah.
the system's not even finished. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, where did we miscommunicate here? Like,
Yeah. Oh
so
yeah, all the time. And that's, just one of those things you expect, and so you again ring the bell, raise the flag, like, all right, contractor, you remember it's in our, specification. You got to give us a heads up. You got to let us know. And so we do remind them because, and sometimes, reminding the client too that says we've got one trip and or two trips. And if you
yeah.
ask us to come back because the tech wasn't there because you forgot to schedule in the tech when we're there, then who do we send that ad service to? Do we send it to the client or to the contractor? And we've
Mm.
had projects where the client was very clear, Mr. Contractor, you're in charge of this. If you failed to schedule it correctly, it's on you. And that works out.
Well, I think that's a really good defense for a lot of specifiers out there who unfortunately
Yeah.
get suckered every now and then. So to be
Yeah.
able to bend the owner's ear and say, hey, you know, it's going to cost you extra if this isn't the right time.
Right.
I don't think everybody has the fortune to be able to do that, and so sometimes you have to like go through the channel of sub consultants to get to the right
Oh yeah.
person. But I think again, advertising for Ron here, our integrator, it's if this happened, I would just give Ron a call and say, hey, is this really like, does this make sense to you? And he'd say, no, we're not ready yet. Like,
Yeah.
so then I
Yeah.
can kick it back and say, please don't schedule this.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Well, then that's part of the advantage of having a project where you do either have the freedom with the client and with the contractor to be able to speak directly to manufacturers or integrators. That's great. Sometimes we don't, we're not able to, right? There's a very like do not pass, no
right,
communication between you and the manufacturers. And so it just depends on the project and the
for
client
sure.
if they're open to it.
I mean, in preparation of those projects, do you get any warning that that's going to be the setup where it's like, okay, this is very structured? I mean, I know public projects, for instance, love to have their clear delineations of scope.
Right.
But is it sometimes when you get into CA, do you get surprised? It's like, whoa, this is so formal. Like,
it's kind of like any relationship. You kind of can tell from the beginning, oh, this is going to be a bureaucratic one. This is going to be a toughie, and we're going to have to stay in color within the lines on this one.
which I think goes back on your point of being experienced, having
Yeah.
those years of experience and being able to pick up, okay, this contractor, they're putting on an air of very
Oh
clearly
yeah.
not wanting to.
Yeah. Oh
So,
yeah.
um,
Yeah,
uh,
and you have those contractors that even though you're helping the project, helping the client, that they don't like you getting in between, and so they will be very quick to say, okay, so you're in charge now, so if something goes wrong, it'll be your fault. And that that quickly reminds you that you need to stay in the lines.
yep. No, that's a really good point. And being able to read the room is almost like an
Yes.
essential skill. So,
Yeah.
um, Ron, you seemed like you had a
Yeah, so I guess when you're designing a control system, I'm curious, do you, and we don't need to name names, but do you have specific manufacturers that you like to go to, or do you focus more around the intent of the control system and then let the contractor or the integrator decide how those, what the controls are going to be to meet that intent?
Yeah, no, for I- probably 95% of our projects or close to that, we are specifying the exact control system manufacturer if it's in our scope, right? If the electrical engineer is in charge of the control system, then we're usually just providing the intent, and then they're specifying, or maybe they're doing a performance spec. But if we're in charge, we're usually identifying who we want to work with. And part of the reason for that is because we want to get into the documentation, a one line diagram. We want to get in the capabilities of the system. We want to make sure that we're including, whatever conversations we've had with the owner and making sure that those needs are being met.
I guess kind of
Cool. And
building
then
off of that. Oh yeah, go.
sorry, I keep jumping on you. Quick follow up to that. When you're in that sort of design for controls, how much now do you bring up to the owner, or do they question the ability for remote access or cloud control or web interface or things like that? Is that a common conversation you're getting into now?
It hasn't been very common recently, but I heard your last podcast, and I heard you saying how much easier it is now, and I'm sure part of that is COVID is it's the new reality. It kind of, whereas before I would often hear clients being sort of hesitant to do that. They don't want an outsider being able to tap into their network, all kinds of stuff. It seems like it's coming up a little bit more recently, and I can only imagine it's if somebody has to wait for the latest spike to go down for some site person to go on and fix whatever, it's all everybody's all of a sudden going, all right, let's think about this. What makes sense? We're not breaking security if we let you control our light levels. And I was really intrigued by what you said last time, because I do wonder how much easier things are going to be in the future if there's a little bit more ability to remote control things in, rather than having to coordinate a site visit.
So, getting back to the question that I had, which is going back to the scope of the project and whether or not you're the one specifying the controls or just the intent. You know, what happens? Let's say, for instance, the designer of the system, who is not you, picks a system that is not going to work for your intent. What happens there?
You're gonna quickly understand that I'm a bell ringer.
So you're going
Then
to give that phone call and say, "Hey, what's going on here?"
I am quick to pick up the phone.
I think that's
Yeah,
great. I think that's
yeah,
really
that
essential.
happens.
I mean,
It,
conversations
it
need to happen.
Yeah, it happens, and every now and then it definitely is an ego boost when you somehow know more than the engineer about what the system can do. It's those are fun. But yeah, no, it occasionally happens where again, you have a relationship with the architect, you kind of know what are the things that they're gonna want to see on the job. and it's the one job, or maybe it's a couple jobs where you're not specifying the system, the engineer is, and they specify something that's definitely not going to meet the aesthetics, or definitely, the keypad isn't going to look as good as the architect's accustomed to, or the system isn't going to have the functionality, or all of a sudden it's a bunch of gack on the wall, as opposed to, how do we simplify it? And then it's just a phone call, and I usually am a little bit more courteous. I'll call the engineer and give them a heads up that, hey, I don't think this is going to work. And if they're hard headed, and then I'll say, all right, let's get on a call with the architect and we'll sort it out together. But it usually clears itself up if you just actually raise your
I,
hand, as opposed to let it go by.
right. I was curious about that because I do know designers. I'm not going to name any names, but who will say, hey, this is not within our scope. We're not going to babysit the engineer or the architect or whoever has this scope. That's on them. And if they drop the ball, maybe they should have hired us. And I think that
Yeah.
while yes, there's a really important delineation there when it comes to fee and making sure that it's clear, okay, you're paying us for a very specific thing. I think there is sort of a collaborative element that's lost in that approach.
Yeah. Yes.
So
Yeah, I 100% agree, and it's easy to go down I think that path of being a stickler with fees, and being a stickler to staying within your boundaries of what your scope is. But again, going back to experience, at some point you start to realize when you're too rigid in that way, um, it'll cost you down the line. It'll either cost you a relationship, or it'll cost you your design, right? One
mhm,
or the other.
yep.
I would say you're extremely lucky if it doesn't cost you one or the other.
No, I agree. And I think, to the point that you started off with, the person who gets blamed if the lights go wrong is the designer. Even if your scope was literally just one portion of the project, it's just this little color changing portion. If
Yep.
something else in the project goes wrong lighting wise, you get blamed for it.
Oh
So
yeah.
same thing with lighting controls.
Yep.
But just to
We
kind
had
of
a project.
yeah.
I was just
No,
we
go
had
ahead.
a
Go ahead. Oh,
project. We had a project where we were just doing it, very simple, like open office space, couple of private offices, and designed it thoroughly, and everybody goes in, and the first phone call we get is the hallway that leads to the bathroom that's not in our scope, but that everybody has to go through before they get into our scope, is 100-foot candles, is way overlit. So by default, our space looks dark. And it's one of those things where it's like, oh God, yeah, but there's 100-foot candles in that corridor. Somebody put in way too many troffers. That is not good design. And it is. If it has anything to do with lighting and you were remotely involved, they're gonna call you.
yeah. And so, I mean, in that situation, if you had the ability to be somewhat proactive, maybe it would have benefited you in the long run to say, hey, this is way over designed.
Yeah.
I don't imagine you did have that ability, but um,
No, and
I,
it's one of those things. Was like, I should have probably asked. This is
which I think is a great way to approach it. I mean,
yeah.
that really says to me you have your client in mind as opposed to your
Oh
fee
yeah.
in mind. So that's really heartening to hear. So,
Yeah.
but to just kind of encapsulate what we've talked about here today, your responsibility on the project really is to represent the owner, to help make sure that the system is designed to what they want and need, and just kind of hover over it. And if maybe you can't hover over it in a certain way, say, hey, this guy Ron over here is an integrator, and I want him to help make sure that this is going to go smoothly in the part of the scope that I can't. I'm not going to be able to hold the contractor's hand. And then, just kind of make sure that everybody understands what to expect when the system's
Yep.
done.
Right.
So, well, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Paula. This was really just a fun conversation. I I
Good.
really appreciate you coming in and chatting about this.
Yeah, no, this was great. It's always fun to talk controls with you.
Any final
But thank you
thoughts,
so much
Ron?
for having me.
No, I mean, I think, it was great. It's nice to get, to hear from somebody else too, from another designer who does value controls and values the integrator. But as an integrator, I also need to sometimes step back and understand that it's not always your decision, right, 100% as to whether or not there is an integrator involved in the project. And you can advocate as much as you want based on the needs of the project, but it still doesn't mean that it's going to happen. But it's
Right.
nice to know that you're there and you're looking out for the owner regardless, and trying to follow everything through. And it's really good. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you guys for having us or having me.
I know you loved Ron and Webb and Paula coming in hot on the conversation series, but you got to check out the magicians. They're ready for you. That's right. Evluma. Go to evluma.com, Greg Eric. What do you got?
You got their OmniMax that gives you all the benefits of LED without sacrificing the light you love. You might want to match that high pressure sodium look, and I can't tell you how many times recently I've had customers say they need that. And you mentioned it before, a lot of people might have a 3000 Kelvin, but to get high pressure sodium
Are
truly
you
to get
stealing
that
my
yellow
lines,
glow,
Greg Eric?
I is, yeah, I am. But to get to that level, 2000 Kelvin will get there, man, and they've got it
Ooh.
built into it. So you know what Evluma can do is maintain ambiance efficiently.
Come on, Evluma. That's because they're magicians.
They
They
are.
wave the magic wand of the Omni. Come on, that light's amazing. 2,000 up to 5,000 Kelvin. And, they're the only ones that have that right now. So go to evluma.com. And, of course, the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, presenting all the lighting industry's best content right here on the internet for you to listen to and enjoy. And also the Lighting Agora. That's right, the Lighting Agora, making education available to the lighting professions and the Lighting Controls Association. And thanks to Webb Marsh and Ron Kuzmar and Paula Martinez-Nobles for participating in our conversation series. Very entertaining. Folks, if you made it to the end with us and with them, thank you. We love you guys. Bye for now.